There once was a place enchanting your darkest desires. There once was a road that crossed all your tranquility. A fight for true love, a fall for timeless lust, secrets of the labyrinth, destroyed bonds at the glance in a mirror. Hearts closed, thorns in prison, a spirit hardened. Rise up, warrior, confess your truth. Join us inside Black Garden.
Good evening, good evening, good evening. Welcome to the Career Dominion podcast with your host, Dominion, and welcome to episode 3 of season 2 of the wonderful Black Garden series. I have a special guest for you here today. We have Mrs. Angela, the Christian Sexpert. How are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. Can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and where you reside?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Angela, the Christian Sexpert. I talk all things sex and intimacy, primarily in Christian marriage, but you don't have to be a Christian to follow me. I'm an influencer, public speaker, sex and intimacy coach, and I recently did the Woman Evolve conference with Sarah Jakes Roberts, where I got to talk all about healthy sex in Christian marriage. And yeah, that's what I do.
Awesome, awesome. And again, welcome back to season 2 of the Black Garden. Season 1 was a wonderful, wonderful season filled with many topics on dating, relationship, and marriage. And again, this is episode 3 of season 2. And before we get started, today's topic, we're going to talk about 13 steps to intimacy in Christian marriage. And so before we get started into that, we always have a disclaimer here in the Black Garden. We're not going to do Neosporin today. We're going to do your Band-Aids and your peroxide. Make sure you have your Band-Aids and peroxide because we don't want the thorns in the Black Garden to hurt you too bad. And so, as always, for all the listeners and viewers on the Career Dominion inside Black Garden, go ahead and grab those Band-Aids and welcome inside. And so with that being said, Angela, what inspired you the most to become a Christian sexpert?
I saw the damage that purity culture had done to women and marriages. I saw the damage that bad theology was continuing to do to women and marriages. And I knew that God had better for us, has better for us. I know that God calls us to abundance in all areas of our lives, and our sex lives are no different. And I really wanted to be part of the solution of helping women and couples have better marriages, better sex lives.
Awesome, awesome. And again, maybe you're listening, maybe you're not married, maybe you're not even Christian, but again, you don't have to be a Christian to follow. With that being said, sex and marriage, is a very touchy subject, especially when it comes to Christianity. Especially myself growing up Pentecostal, you were just taught that you stay abstinent, don't have kids out of wedlock, stay abstinent till you get married. And then for many Christians out there, like Angela said, it's like that theology of, okay, what do we do now once we're married? And, how does it all work? Depending on the type of denomination, and the type of way you grew up Christian, it was like, how dare you think about sex and have sex? But again, um, you only know what you know. And so Angela's going to bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to the topic here today. And so because she had to tell me 3 times, there's 13, not 12, 13. So she's going to break those down for us. And so, Angela, I'll let you go ahead and get rolling.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the arguments that I get a lot online is because I say, like, if a woman isn't safe to say no to sex, she's not safe to say yes. And so I get a lot of people really upset with me because they're like, well, sex is the most important part of intimacy in marriage. Sex is how you were supposed to be intimate. And I'm like, y'all are missing the boat. There's actually 13 different types of intimacy that we can experience in marriage. Sex is only one of those. Sex is actually meant to be the celebration of intimacy that you and your spouse establish before you ever reach the bedroom. And so if you don't already have intimacy established, what are you celebrating? And people really struggle to like figure out how do they establish intimacy before they ever reach the bedroom. And so we break it down into the different types. So the first one is aesthetic intimacy. Those are kind of like your Instagram moments. Like you go and you get coffee and you watch the sunset together. It's the moments of beauty that you guys can look back on with fondness and happy memories, things like that. And at any time, if you have a question about one of these, stop me because I will just go on a roll. So we have commitment intimacy. Commitment intimacy is all about how far you've come, where you started from, where you're going. So doing things like looking at your wedding pictures or the inside jokes in your marriage are a big part of your commitment intimacy because it's sort of like what defines you as a couple. Communication intimacy is pretty self-explanatory. How do you communicate? Are you really trying to hear their perspective? Are you effectively communicating your perspective? And that one actually leads right into one that people misunderstand a lot, and that's conflict intimacy. A lot of people feel really threatened if they have conflict in the relationship because as a generation, we really haven't been taught to do conflict well. And people think it's some sort of like mark of pride to say, well, we never fight, we never have conflict. And I kind of side eye those couples. One of you isn't communicating your own boundaries and preferences if y'all have never had a conflict. There are absolutely ways that we can do conflict poorly and fight poorly, but conflict is a sort of natural state of the human condition. And if you do conflict right and you do it well, you will walk out of conflict feeling more intimate and closer to your spouse, feeling like you have grown as a couple.
I love that you said those last three that you just said. I kind of want to pause and talk about those in a
Yes.
deeper context because again, you said communication, commitment, then you said communication, then you said conflict. And I think not just marriage, but it's specifically marriage and just relationships in general. Again, when you started, you were like, hey, sex is not the only one. Everybody probably rolled their eyes. I know a couple people probably rolled their eyes and were like, I thought I thought that was going to be number one. But the last three, you broke down the commitment, the communication, and the conflict. I think that I want to kind of break that down deeper because I think that builds the foundation of the relationship and the intimacy. Because again, if you can't commit, then you shouldn't be married in the first place. If you can't communicate, then it's hard to be in a happy, successful marriage. And then again, once you're committed to being married and you're starting to communicate, it's how do you resolve a lack of communication or a miscommunication? So, in your experience, how do you help couples once they, like I said, they're already committed, doing good, they're communicating well? How do what do you say to those couples that say they're kind of like that perfect, white picket fence couple that don't do conflict? And how do you work with couples to get through that?
So, like I said, if they're trying to claim, oh, we don't have conflict, things like that, either you guys haven't been together long enough to face conflict, or one of you, or potentially both of you, is actively suppressing your own wants and desires and boundaries to conflict. Avoiding conflict is not healthy because it's just going to grow and grow and grow over time. And so you have to have healthy tools and you have to have healthy communication to resolve conflict. But claiming an absence of conflict is not healthy because it could be something as simple as, he wants to paint the living room blue and I hate blue and I don't, I want to being great or something. Like at its base level, that's conflict. People think conflict means fight, and it doesn't. Conflict is simply a disagreement. So you might already have healthy ways of resolving your disagreements, and that's fantastic. But to say that you have no conflict is not true because there's always going to be conflict.
I love that you said that because again, we always, as humans, you have to like stay on positive because mentally natural human emotion is to automatically go to where you're arguing, yelling, screaming. Again, I love that you said that the conflict is, it's just a simple disagreement, and it goes back to some of the principles of marriage of we always hear like, hey, you just settle or just do it so they can be quiet or just go with the flow, right? And essentially what we're saying is, that's not exactly the most healthy way to go about marriage because, again, something as simple as I know for a lot of couples, I'm a chef, so a lot of food, like, hey, babe, what do you want to eat for dinner? And it's like, I want this, and your wife or your spouse hates steak, so why would you pick a steakhouse? And then something simple as that is a conflict, but some people, would just be like, hey, let's just go whatever, let's just eat.
Look, we have had a week-long food conflict in this household because my husband's favorite, like one of his favorite meals is spaghetti. And we had a period of time where he made it for dinner because he would be at home parent for a while. And he made it so often, I got burnt out on it. So I don't make it very often now that I'm the at home parent because he burned me out on it because it's his favorite. Well, I had put it on our shared meal plan for last week, and then his schedule is wonky because he's a truck driver. So we wound up not having it last week. And then I had moved it to the meal plan for this week, but I always do the recipes that require the fresh ingredients like at the beginning of the week and do the meals that don't require fresh ingredients like spaghetti at the end of the week, like right before I go to the grocery store. And so it's been like a week and a half, and every day he's like, "Are we gonna have why aren't we having spaghetti tonight?" And I'm like, "Dude, slow your roll." Like earlier this week, I forget I had something that was gonna it was an avocado. There was how temperamental avocados are. And that was the day the avocado was going to go bad. So I had to use the recipe for the avocado that day. And then I've had a bag of spinach sitting in the fridge for a week. And so I had to use the spinach for the recipe tonight. And this man is like, I want the spaghetti, Angela. And this week long conflict over spaghetti. And I'm like, do you want to meal plan? You can meal plan. You can cook. It's fine.
Get that man his spaghetti.
Seriously. At this point, he's probably gonna make it for himself tomorrow if I don't cook it for him.
That's
Like,
funny
that's
because
it. It's a conflict. He's upset, right? He's upset that I have not made his spaghetti. We're not fighting about it. Nobody's screaming at each other. But, some grumpy words have been exchanged over spaghetti because we are real people. Just because I'm the Christian sexpert does not mean my marriage is perfect. Apparently, all it takes is one missed meal of spaghetti in this household.
those Bronx cut noodles will put them over the edge.
It's just too much for him to handle. So, I mean, it's just one example of how we're not perfect. We definitely had a little moment of me going, "Do you want to meal plan? Really? Okay, go for it." And he's like, "No, I just want spaghetti."
Yeah, and I love that you said that because again, it goes back to the previous two. Again, you guys are obviously committed because you've been married, and then the communication was we're meal planning on a weekly basis, and the conflict was, hey, I wanted spaghetti when it was put on the calendar. Why don't I have my spaghetti? And what we're saying for the listeners and viewers is that again, we're not perfect, but it's little things like that. where again, we can, sit on a podcast and laugh about it. And again, they're not fighting and screaming and degrading each other over bronze cut noodles. You can still be, and what we're getting at, especially with the conflict, is just because it's a conflict doesn't mean things have to go awry within the communication and the commitment of the marriage. Again, it could be the painted walls. You don't like the color blue, especially on walls. Be able to communicate that to your spouse, I think, is the biggest part of that. Again, that communication, because without the commitment and communication, then the conflict, you know, becomes null and void. And then that's how it escalates to fights. And so on that intertwined with the communication and the conflict, how do you, what would you say to couples that are maybe having trouble with the communication part in the first place before they even get to the conflict?
Communication has a lot of its root in our family of origin, because you grow up with one style of communication and you don't. Sometimes we grow up in so much dysfunction that we realize this is super toxic and dysfunctional. I never want to be like this. And we can potentially swing too far in the other direction. Or we grow up and not being able, we grow up with rose colored glasses, or we grow up so enmeshed that we don't have the ability to recognize the toxicity in our own home. And we carry that into our marriage. Because I don't care how healthy your childhood was, there was something that was unhealthy about your family of origin, because no family is perfect. And I think sometimes those people who feel like they had idyllic childhoods are the ones who struggle the most to realize where the dysfunction that they have internalized comes from. But there is, at some point, there was something that you internalized that was dysfunctional. And I saw this amazing article. So one of the things I talk about with my clients a lot is I saw this amazing article a couple of years ago, and I wish I could cite the author off the top of my head, but I can't. That's something I should probably memorize. But it's called Ask Culture versus Guest Culture. And it really illustrates how family of origin impacts communication in our marriage. So I'm going to give you an example. Some families are Ask culture families, other families are guest culture families. So if I grew up in a guest culture family, an example would be I schedule a meeting with a client, but my husband winds up having to work overnight on the truck and I need a babysitter for my son. And so if I grew up in guest culture, I would call my mom and I would be like, oh my gosh, I have this meeting with this client that I can't reschedule, but my husband has to work out. I don't have a babysitter. I just don't know what I'm going to do. I'm so stressed out. And then I would stop talking. And because I'm in a guest culture family, that opens the opportunity for my mother to say, do you need me to babysit? Now, in Ask culture family, I would say, I'm so stressed. I have this meeting. I don't have a babysitter. Can you babysit? If I was from an Ask culture family, but a guest culture, I don't ask the question because the guest culture perceives the direct question as rude, as too forward, as too direct. Whereas the Ask culture family is going to perceive the not asking as passive aggressive. And so if you have a guest culture husband coming in with an Ask culture wife, they're going to butt heads because he's going to think that she's too forward, too direct, too aggressive. She's going to think that he's passive aggressive. And that's where the conflict's going to come in, when really it's just two different styles of communicating. And they may not be self-aware enough to realize that these are two different communication styles. Neither one is better than the other. Neither one is right, especially for these smaller, less consequential things like I need a babysitter. We're not talking about major life decisions like moving across the country here. If that's what we're talking about, like, yes, you do need direct communication. But for the smaller things, if guest culture works for you, that's okay. And so really helping clients to understand that you might have two different communication styles, and one isn't necessarily better, but these are all messages that you've internalized from your family of origin. And so you need to identify the messages that you've internalized and figure out what is actually going to be the healthiest method of communication for both you and your spouse.
I love how you broke that down because, again, just going back to how we're raised, you look at your parents and their marriages, if they were married, and you just look at, marriages in general. And a lot of times, we see that even outside of relationships with just, how we interact with coworkers and et cetera. You might say, why don't you just ask me to do, why don't you just ask me to do the report for you, or that you're running late? Even as a leader, we get a lot from, teammates, why don't you just ask if you could, stay late or come in late because, your kid got sick and but you or something like that. And same thing with the as culture, you don't have to, take direct, form as a term of offense. And especially in, relationships and in this topic marriage, you know, like you said, the husband might be the direct one, or a lot of times it's the a wife that's the direct one, and he's like, "Chill out! Like, why do you, why are you yelling at me?" And it's not always; it's just how she speaks.
Well, and we have a further complication with evangelical culture, right? Where we have all of this twisting of scripture telling women, well, you can't speak, you have to be quiet and submissive, especially in a lot of the more fundamentalist sects. We have complementarianism, where the man is the head of the household, the woman has to submit all the time. But then what you'll hear the wives talking about, and some pastors will even say it from the pulpit, is, you know, the husband might be the head, but the wife is the neck. And that really is just setting the couple up for manipulation, right? So instead of being able to outright be direct with her spouse, she has to figure out how to manipulate him to turn the head the way that she wants it to go, instead of just having clear communication. And so you have these cultural issues that are impacting the marriage and the communication and conflict as well. That, especially if you are from a more fundamentalist sect of Christianity, you've probably gotten messaging that, a wife can't ever oppose her husband's opinion. There are some Christian marriage books written directed at women who say the most ridiculous and absurd things. But one specific example I'm thinking of is, if you're in the car with your husband and he's driving, if he misses the exit on the highway, don't say anything, because he needs your respect. He needs you to submit to him even when he's making a mistake. So you potentially are going to make your entire family late for whatever you're going to, because your husband's ego is so fragile, you can't tell him, hey, you're going to miss that exit. And that is, that sort of messaging really messes up marriages.
I love that you said that because, again, growing up in church, we were taught, the man's the house, the head honcho, right? Hey, you just cook, clean, take care of the kids. Back then, and I love what you said about the culture because a lot of times we go, you know, we still have to evolve with the times, right? Back then, women couldn't preach, women couldn't get a job, in society. There's a lot of different, you know, lack of woman rights from back then, especially in marriage. You kind of just, like you said, took care of the house, stayed at home, and, whichever way, your specific marriage, I always say, take one thing and resonate with what's said here today. One person's marriage or one ideology of marriage in the Christian household doesn't have to be, oh, what the pastor said that she can't, talk back. Hey, everything I say goes, do what's right for your family, your marriage. But what we're also saying is that, again, you know, you should be able to have that commitment, like we talked about earlier, to be able to communicate to your spouse and this example, your husband, like, hey, 2 minutes, this exit coming up. We can't be late for our event. Or, we got to get hey, maybe it's traveling to church on Sunday. Like, hey, if you take, we got construction on I-70. If you don't take, you got to take the exit before, you got to take exit 12, because if we try to go to exit 14, we're going to get stuck in construction. You should be able to, that's just one example, but you should be able to effectively communicate with your a significant other and your spouse on simple things like that, because and then going to the conflict, if you can't resolve small, simple tasks and conflicts like that, when we get to those bigger things, those bigger decisions, that's when, the arguments, the snowballing, and all the lack of respect and all that stuff kind of starts happening.
And I think that also that sort of framework that silences a woman's voice is not recognizing it is women are image bearers of Christ just as men are. And so you are not recognizing her ability to hear from the Holy Spirit just as much, just as much as you are able when you are setting up that sort of framework in marriage. This took a sharp turn from where I usually talk about the intimacies. God, the Bible, there's a lot of bad theology, and I could just rabbit trail on this all day. But the Bible says that we are to be as iron sharpening iron to each other, not just, only men can sharpen men, only women can sharpen women. No, that applies to marriage as well. And that applies to communication in marriage as well. And so just because your spouse, and this goes for both men and women, just because you feel disrespected does not mean that you were disrespected. So just because you feel like your spouse is saying something disrespectful does not mean that they are actually being disrespectful. And again, this goes back to your childhood, your internalized traumas and triggers and things like that. Now, maybe you had parents that fought a lot. And so any sort of perceived criticism is a trigger to your self-identity and your self-worth, when realistically, they could just be stating a fact. Because remember, information is not an attack. They could just be stating a fact. And that doesn't mean that they're attacking you or disrespecting you. And if you're perceiving that as disrespect or some sort of attack, that is what is actually hindering your communication. It's not, well, they shouldn't communicate to me in that way. It's the way that you are receiving it is what is the actual hindrance there.
I love that you said that the information is not an attack. That's a great, cliff note quote. I love that one. And then also, like you said, perception. We all have our own confirmation bias, right? And so seek actual clarification and don't just perceive. Because we all come from different cultures, different, like you said, upbringings, backgrounds, and so a lot of what we grow up with is that, we get that ideology from our parents or who raised us. So if your mom, said this certain word or this is how she talked, and that's how you grew up, you're going to have a certain perception of that. So then when your wife talks to you that way, you might, think she's being aggressive and being disrespectful, when in reality, she's just making a statement.
Right. And I think it's absolutely essential that if you do have certain triggers and traumas, that your wife or husband respects that. For example, my husband's parents had a certain phrase that they weaponized against him. And when we got married, he let me know, they said this word to me. It bothers me to hear that word. And so for 21 years, I don't use that word. Even if I'm thinking it, I search for a different word, right? To try and communicate what I'm trying to say without the use of that specific word, because he has communicated to me that this is a personal trigger for me. So it's absolutely valid to ask your spouse to respect trigger words and respect your traumas and things like that. But you also need to be self-aware enough to step outside of that and say, okay, are they actually trying to attack me or are they trying to communicate and I am struggling to hear what they're saying because of my own issues? Because if you guys are on the same team, are they really going to try to attack you? Probably not.
I love that you said that because it brings me to the point, and then we'll move on to the next one. Um, watch, listen to your significant other and your spouse on triggers, and not just words, but um, and be convicted in those triggers. What I mean by that is, take your spouse's words seriously. If they grew up in trauma and you know, certain words, trigger them and they communicate that openly and directly, then you need to make sure, if you're going to stay in that committed marriage that, hey, that's something that needs to be honored. If not, then you're again kind of doing psychological manipulation by using a person's triggers when you know they're triggers.
Yeah, that's just straight up disrespect. Why that, like, if you are using someone's triggers against them, go to therapy and identify why you feel the need to do that. Why are you trying to hurt your spouse on purpose? So, which actually kind of segues into one of the next ones, which is crisis intimacy. It's all about like how do you handle yourselves and your marriage in a crisis? And I think a lot of marriages we think of crisis as being like normally when I talk about crisis intimacy, it's I talk about when my grandparents died or when my husband's grandparents died because they died 3 days apart and how we walked and I was like 7 months pregnant at the time. And so how we handled that is normally what I talk about with crisis intimacy. But crisis intimacy can also be like one of you realizing, oh my gosh, we need some real outside help because one of us is engaging in unhealthy behaviors that are destructive to themselves, myself, the marriage, things like that. And so that can absolutely be a crisis that you navigate as a couple.
Awesome, awesome. And then again, we're kind of like I said, going like conflict and crisis. And for those of you that for crisis, what I want to say is show yourself grace, right? Everybody deals with trauma and heals differently. So again, have that open, going back to what we said before, you're already committed, have that communication. And you already know at this point, you already know how to resolve conflict. So now when crisis comes, use that communication piece. Like, hey, this is how I grieve. This is how I grieve, maybe, and uh, it's okay to take a step back. It's okay to take a step back. So if you communicate that, but communicate that's like, hey, when I was a kid, my grandparents died, and so every time I go through something like that, I like to just take a couple hours and just sit by myself and just listen to my favorite music, right? But when you get in a marriage, you need to communicate that to your spouse so that if something happens while you're married, that maybe a family member passes or something like that nature, when you go in the other room, you say, hey, babe, I'm going to, listen to my music. They already know, hey, that's how they just give them a couple hours, you know, to listen to his music and then come back and then um, kind of talk it out and move forward. And so just make sure, again, show yourself grace, but also having that open communication so you can navigate those crises more efficiently to strengthen, again, because it's all about strengthening each other, during those tough times. And you should be able to console within your spouse and have that like rock in a hard place and be on that shoulder to help each other get through that.
One of the things that I like to counsel my couples with for crisis intimacy is after you have walked through a crisis, talk about what worked really well and what you guys could do differently during the next crisis. So was it one of you was overwhelmed with information coming from too many sources? So, maybe one of you takes point for the next time you're faced with a crisis and sort of filters all of the information into more easily digestible bite-sized pieces for the person that was overwhelmed. Or, for example, at the conference that I was just at, because also, like, aside from sexual intimacy, all of these intimacies are things that you can experience in any relationship that you're in. And so at the conference that I was just at Women Evolve, I hit a point where my spicy brain could not handle it anymore. And I hit crisis mode. I just sort of fell apart in my hotel room. And my best friend at the time just took over. And she's like, that's it. You're cut off. No one is allowed to talk to you. You're not handling any other communication with anyone else. She took over handling all communication between me and the team for the conference. She even texted my husband and said, you're not allowed to talk to your wife unless it's to tell her she's pretty. Don't ask her any questions. All questions come through me. Literally don't tell her anything except you love her and she's pretty. And that really, her stepping in that moment was a form of crisis intimacy for me, and taking all of that responsibility off my shoulders, knowing that I didn't have to make any decisions. I didn't have to answer any questions. I could just focus on what I was there to do. I could focus on my message. I could focus on meeting people, networking, which was one of the primary reasons I was there. Really took a lot of weight off my shoulders. And that was her really showing up in a crisis intimacy sort of way for me. Because again, these are all things that you can experience in not just your marital relationship, aside from the sexual intimacy. Like, don't do that with somebody that's not your spouse.
It's a disclaimer.
I just really want to make that clear.
You got to tell them nowadays. They were like, so I can do this with anybody?
That's literally not what I said.
Please
The Christian
don't. If you want
expert said, no, the Christian expert did not say.
we do not endorse any adultery on this topic. Right. Now, I love you said that though, and it goes back to, again, find safe people in your life, people that will, help you and your spouse get through that. Find that, everybody deserves to have someone. And like you said, it was a women's conference for you, it could be, maybe it's at your job, and, maybe you have that, maybe you're a coordinator or an accountant or some sort, and you just, like you said, you have that, hey, I'm overwhelmed, you should be able to have somebody that could, in your corner to be like, hey, you're not doing the books today. I got it. You take, everybody deserves, again, going back to say, show yourself grace. Everybody deserves to, take a deep breath and a step back and kind of just woo-saw. And, you should be able to be in a position where you can do that. And again, it goes back to that communication, like, hey, go to your spouse, hey, babe, I need to take tomorrow off work. I need to decompress and just not do any booking or any accounting. And then your spouse should, like, I know we were talking about spaghetti, jokingly earlier, but, your spouse should be able to, hold the fort down for that little while. Like, hey, my wife needs to rest. I'm going to cook. I'm going to I know she's supposed to cook and have the meal prep. Hey, I'm going to take that over and cook today. So that way she can just rest and eat and decompress. And then when she's back to her, normal, natural self, then we can resume, our daily routine. Be flexible, within your marriage when it comes to, because like I said, everybody has, good and bad times. That's kind of one of the vows they say when you get married, everybody's not going to be there 100% every day. And so you should be able to communicate that with your spouse and work that out to where if one is burnt out on something happening, one can kind of take over for that short period of time. There's always seasons within that marriage.
Definitely. I know that this really took a sharp turn kind of away from the different types of intimacy, but I'll run through some of the other ones. We have creative intimacy. It's all about how you're creative together. Pre-kids, my husband and I did community theater together. He loves doing stage lighting. I love acting. It really worked well because he made me look good on the stage. And we got to sort of we had a lot of late nights at the theater, just the two of us setting the stage lights and really getting to be creative and talk about what worked, what didn't, what we got to experiment, things like that. Emotional intimacy. This is talked about a lot in popular media, but it's all about recognizing, your spouse's emotions, supporting them, meeting their emotional bids for connection. My husband is one of the people that do you remember the old like Discovery Channel when they would have the like top 10 roller coasters in North America and they would interview the weird people with the roller coaster patches?
Oh,
That's my
yeah.
husband. That's my husband through and through. He is a roller coaster geek. I don't personally care. I will ride that. I used to ride them more in my younger days, but having developed a chronic illness, I can't do them as much anymore. But he still will come home and be like, babe, this roller coaster in Cedar Point, blah, blah, blah. And, I could, if I was not invested in his emotional bits for connection, just sort of brush him off, be like, okay, whatever. But, because I want to meet his emotional bits for connection, I work to be interested and ask questions about the things that are important to him, like roller coasters. So there's that. Intellectual intimacy is one that I think people don't understand a lot, but intellectual intimacy could be like learning something new together. But it could also be understanding why they think the way that they do. So, for example, what sort of childhood trauma led you to believe that pineapple belongs on a pizza? Would be sort of intellectual intimacy. Then we have parenting intimacy. Any woman who has ever watched her husband hold their newborn on his chest immediately after birth and had her ovaries stand up and say, do it again, knows exactly what I'm talking about with parenting intimacy. We are out of that early newborn toddlerhood stage ourselves, and we are into the depths of tween parenting in this household. And watching my husband regulate his own emotions so that he can try and teach our 10-year-old to regulate his emotions is possibly one of the sexiest things I've ever witnessed in my entire life. And every mother of a 10-year-old understands exactly what I am talking about when I say that. So parenting intimacy is definitely one. Obviously, parenting intimacy isn't for all couples, but it is, if you have kids, that is actually a form of intimacy. Recreational intimacy is one of my favorites to talk about because it's all about how you have fun together. Typically, when I have couples entering coaching with me, they are coming to me because of a libido mismatch where he wants sex more often, she doesn't want it as often, and they are struggling to make it work in the bedroom. And almost inevitably, when I talk about the other 12 types of intimacy, recreational intimacy has long since exited the building because in order to be our fully sexual selves with our spouse, we have to be safe to play with our spouse. And if we do not feel safe to play, we are not going to feel safe to be sexual. And so you need to, if you are struggling in your marriage, the first thing I'm going to ask you is, how do you have fun together? And usually I'm going to hear, well, we don't. So figuring out how you used to have fun together and how you can start to have fun together again is essential.
I love that one because it just goes back to like dating. How many times we go on that nice date and it's go-kart, maybe it's bowling, maybe it's a nice dinner, maybe it's the laughs, maybe it's, the good times. And again, you're developing that communication and that camaraderie of being safe. A woman wants to feel safe in your arms, right? And so once you develop that, then you can also, again, build on that. And then don't stop when you get married, right? Continue to have fun. And then, your relationship will blossom because you'll be surprised how fun life is when you're having fun together.
Yeah, 100%. I really think recreational intimacy is one of, I kind of refer to these as like a pie chart that you need all of them to make it work. But I really do think that if you are struggling in your recreational intimacy, that's a hallmark for you're probably struggling in a lot of the other areas as well. And then we have sexual intimacy. pretty obvious. Spiritual intimacy. Do you guys pray together? Do you go to church together? Do you read the Bible together? Do you share what the Holy Spirit has been talking to you about? Again, this goes back to the communication intimacy, where if your theology is telling you that a woman cannot speak up and speak directly to you for things, you are silencing her spiritual intimacy with you. Because if you're unwilling to hear what the Holy Spirit is telling her, that being willing to hear what the Holy Spirit is teaching her and telling her is a hallmark of spiritual intimacy. And then the last one is work intimacy. So don't make it weird. Don't, show up at their office. Work intimacy is all about working towards your common goals. So we're seeing a big sort of comeback of recession hobbies. So things like gardening and canning are making a big comeback right now, but those are also both examples of work intimacy. If you plant a garden together, you have a common goal of feeding your family. Working in the garden together is a form of potentially both work intimacy and recreational intimacy, because I think we've kind of talked about how all of the intimacies build on and interplay with each other.
Awesome, awesome. And all this kind of reminds me of the food chart, the health class, you got to have your vegetables, you got to have your dairy, you got to have your wheats, got to have your meat. And as you guys, I hope everybody has been listening and viewing and really keying into these different intimacy types, because again, the goal is to have a successful, abundant, God leading marriage. And in order to have that, what you should have known by now is it's not just about sex. So, and again, sex is only for your spouse. So those are the two main things thus far that should have been taken away from the start. And then the last one is a bonus, but just make sure Angela's husband gets his spaghetti.
Poor wife man.
Right. Those bronze cut noodles, those are a game changer for sure. And so with that being said, again, you covered, all 13, intimacy types. And I know there's some couples out there that are, for those of you that are been married a long time, and also those kind of newlyweds get that little honeymoon stage, what advice would you give, couples that are, kind of struggling with, intimacy in general, and, what kind of tips and motivation would you give to them?
So I actually have a product called the 31 Days of Intimacy, and it walks couples through each of the intimacies day by day over the course of a month. And that would really help them kind of hone in on, well, these are the areas that we're lacking, and here are some practical steps that we can do to improve this area of our intimacy. And so that is, I think, the biggest thing is, checking out a resource to really help you identify this is where we're struggling. This is kind of a few of the things that we need to do to improve.
Awesome, awesome. And in your opinion, what is the most difficult type of intimacy to build?
Oh gosh, I think that's going to be different for every couple, because again, this goes back to the whole, what was your childhood like? What are your traumas and your triggers? If you are, especially like if it's a woman who was raised in purity culture, who was shamed for any sort of sexual identity at all, it could be the sexual intimacy is the most challenging. But if he was raised in a boys don't cry, man up, tough it out sort of household, he's going to really struggle with emotional intimacy. And so, it also could be the woman who struggles with emotional intimacy, because if she believed, if her emotions were weaponized against her as a child, where emotions are a sign of weakness or vulnerability, she could really struggle to emotionally connect as well. So I think that's really going to depend on the couple and, what sort of trauma they're bringing into the marriage.
Awesome, awesome. I love that you said that. And the reason I asked that is because I want everyone listening to understand what we were saying in the beginning is find one thing that resonates with you. Again, show yourself grace. Every marriage is different. You know, just because something is said, that you hear, take everything with a grain of salt, do your own research and apply that to what situation is in your marriage. again, every marriage is different, like she said. And so what we want to do, in our marriages to make them more fruitful is, again, apply what we need to apply. If you're listening and you're like, we're great on emotional intimacy, well, cool, check mark the box, but what about the other 12? So just, again, make sure you're applying what you need to apply. And then on that, if you think it's check mark, when's the last time you checked, it's kind of like a car with the oil. When's the last time you checked the gauge on that emotional? Or are you just assuming that it's good because it was good last week or last year or at the beginning of the marriage? And so with that being said, what are any last minute motivation tips that you would give, married couples or those that are looking to build a fruitful, God-led marriage, and then also tell them where they could find you?
Yeah, I imagine that some people saw my title, The Christian Sexpert, and thought this was going to be all about sex. And they might be feeling a little disappointed right now. So here's a tip regarding sex. Healthy women in safe marriages don't turn down good sex for no reason. So if you are struggling with the sex in your marriage, there's a reason. It's not that men are more sexual. That's a lie. Women are just as sexual as men. We're just not socialized to be allowed to express our sexuality in the same way. And so if you are struggling in your sexual intimacy, you need to not only look at the other 12 intimacies to see if you're lacking in one of those areas, and that's why you're not feeling connected enough to want to have sex, but there could be another reason as well. And you need to identify the root cause before you can fix the problem. And if you need help identifying the root cause or fixing the problem with either your sexual intimacy or any of the other 12, you can find me at my website, thechristiansexpert.com. And I am the Christian Sexpert across all socials.
Awesome, awesome. Again, it's been a wonderful episode 3 inside the Black Garden. Again, we're safe, y'all. I hope you use the Band-Aids if you need it. I'm sorry that, if you're out there listening, like, my wife needs to make spaghetti, we understand your pain. So if you listen to this, go ahead and have some spaghetti tonight once you're done listening to this episode. Go ahead and follow the Christian Sexpert on socials, as well as check out her website for wonderful tips and expanded knowledge. To always encourage those to gain higher counsel, right? You only know what you know. For a lot of us listening, you probably never heard of the 13 intimacies. You were like, I need sex and I need it now, like J.G. Wentworth, right? It's kind of like the Cookie Monster. Like, nope, it's sex. I need it. And you're like, what do you mean the other 12? I don't need my emotions. I need sex, right? And so hope, everyone took something that resonates with you and to apply it daily to your marriage and to your life, to, decree the dominion of your mind, to reveal the true light that shines. Again, it's been a wonderful episode 3 here with Mrs. Angela, the Christian Sexpert. Again, go ahead and follow her for some extended knowledge or any follow-up questions you may have on those 13 intimacy types. Until next time inside Black Garden, this has been Dominion and Angela, and we'll see you on the other side of the Black Garden. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Decree of Dominion. I hope today's episode empowered you to reclaim your voice and walk boldly in your truth. Remember, healing is a journey, and you don't have to walk it alone. If you found value in this episode, make sure to follow us on Spotify and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiring stories and conversations. Stay connected with our community on Facebook and Instagram, where we share resources, encouragement, and continue the conversation. And don't forget, your story matters. Until next time, keep declaring the dominion of the darkest parts of your mind to reveal your true light that shines. God bless you.